The fluorescent lights in Metro General Hospital's emergency room flickered with their usual sterile intensity as Sarah Chen clocked in for what she assumed would be another routine 12-hour shift. The morning coffee hadn't even finished brewing when the first ambulance screamed into the bay, its sirens cutting through the typical hospital murmur like a blade through silk. Sarah adjusted her navy scrubs and pulled her dark hair back into a practical ponytail, unaware that within the next hour, everything she understood about life and death would be shattered beyond recognition. The paramedics wheeled in a middle-aged man whose face was a canvas of deep scratches and bite marks, his eyes rolled back showing only whites while his body convulsed with an unnatural violence that required 3 orderlies to restrain him. "Found him like this in Central Park," the lead paramedic gasped, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "He was attacking joggers, wouldn't stop even when we tossed him twice." Sarah had seen drug-induced psychosis before, but something about this patient's behavior felt different, more primal and desperate, as if some fundamental switch in his brain had been permanently flipped. Dr. Marcus Webb, the graying veteran who'd seen everything from battlefield injuries to overdoses, took one look at the man and immediately ordered him sedated and restrained in Isolation Room 3. The second case arrived 20 minutes later, then a third, each patient displaying the same disturbing symptoms: extreme aggression, apparent immunity to pain, and an almost animalistic hunger that seemed focused entirely on attacking other human beings. Sarah found herself running between rooms, administering sedatives, and cleaning wounds that looked disturbingly like human bite marks, deep and jagged, as if the victims had been savagely mauled. The hospital's usual organized chaos was escalating into something far more sinister, with security guards posted at every entrance and the police scanner crackling with reports of similar incidents across the city. By 9:30, the emergency room was reaching capacity, and Sarah noticed that many of the victims weren't just aggressive, they were displaying signs of advanced decomposition despite being brought in alive, their skin taking on a grayish pallor and their movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. She was checking on the first patient when it happened. The man who had been heavily sedated and pronounced stable suddenly opened his eyes, but they were no longer human eyes, they were clouded and vacant, filled with an insatiable hunger that made Sarah's blood run cold. Without warning, he lunged at her with impossible speed for someone who should have been unconscious, his teeth snapping inches from her throat before she stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man's restraints snapped like paper as he continued his relentless advance, and Sarah's scream brought Dr. Webb running, but what they saw defied every principle of medical science they'd ever learned. The patient had no pulse, no measurable brain activity, yet he moved with deadly purpose, his mouth opening and closing in a grotesque parody of eating. Webb grabbed a fire extinguisher and struck the man across the head, a blow that would have dropped any living person, but the patient simply turned his attention to the doctor, lunging forward with those snapping teeth. It was Jake Morrison, the maintenance worker who'd been fixing a broken light fixture, who saved them both by tackling the patient to the ground, but even Jake's considerable strength couldn't keep the thing subdued for long. That's when they heard the screams echoing from other rooms throughout the hospital, a symphony of terror that confirmed their worst fears. This wasn't isolated to one patient. Sarah's training kicked in as she grabbed a surgical scalpel from the nearby tray, her hands shaking but her mind focused on survival, while Webb barricaded the door with a medical cart and Jake searched desperately for something to use as a weapon. Through the small window in the door, they watched in horror as other patients, staff members, and visitors who had been bitten were transforming into the same mindless, flesh-hungry creatures, their humanity stripped away and replaced by an insatiable need to feed. The hospital's intercom crackled to life with a panicked announcement about a code black, a term Sarah had never heard before but instinctively understood meant that everything they'd known about the natural order of life and death had just been turned upside down. As the sounds of chaos grew louder in the corridors outside, Sarah realized with crystal clarity that this wasn't just a medical emergency or a terrorist attack, this was the beginning of the end of the world as they knew it, and their only chance of survival lay in getting out of the hospital before they too became part of the growing army of the undead. The barricaded door shuddered under the relentless pounding of what had once been patients and staff, their moans creating a horrifying chorus that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. Sarah pressed her back against the medical supply cabinet, clutching the scalpel so tightly her knuckles had turned white, while Dr. Webb frantically searched through his phone for any official emergency protocols that might explain what was happening. Jake Morrison wiped sweat from his brow and gestured toward the ventilation grate near the ceiling, his voice barely above a whisper as he explained that the maintenance tunnels could provide a route to the hospital's service areas if they could somehow reach them without alerting the creatures outside. The sound of breaking glass from the adjacent room made their decision for them. They had perhaps minutes before their makeshift barricade would fail, and Sarah found herself thinking about her younger sister Maya, who worked across town at an elementary school, praying that whatever was happening here hadn't spread that far. Webb stuffed his medical bag with whatever supplies he could grab while Sarah filled her pockets with syringes, antibiotics, and pain medication, knowing instinctively that these items would become more valuable than gold in whatever world awaited them outside. Jake had managed to pry open the ventilation grate using a crowbar from his tool belt, and though the opening looked barely large enough for a person to crawl through, it represented their only hope of escape from what the hospital had become. The journey through the cramped ventilation system was a nightmare of sharp metal edges and suffocating darkness, with Sarah leading the way using her phone's flashlight while the sounds of chaos grew both louder and more distant as they navigated the building's hidden arteries. They emerged into a maintenance corridor where Jake's intimate knowledge of the hospital's layout proved invaluable, guiding them through a maze of service tunnels that most staff members never knew existed. It was here that they encountered Elena Rodriguez, a security guard who had barricaded herself in the electrical room after watching her partner get torn apart by a group of infected visitors, her uniform torn and bloodied but her resolve unbroken as she joined their desperate escape attempt. Their group expanded further when they discovered Tommy Chen, a 17-year-old who had been visiting his grandmother in the oncology ward when the outbreak began, his youthful face streaked with tears but his survival instinct sharp as he led them to a service elevator that Jake hadn't known about. The elevator ride to the roof felt like an eternity, with each floor bringing new sounds of destruction and the growing realization that the infection had spread throughout the entire building, transforming doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors into mindless predators driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The rooftop emergency exit opened onto a scene that defied comprehension, the city skyline, normally a testament to human achievement and progress, now painted a hellish orange by fires that burned unchecked across multiple districts. Smoke billowed from overturned cars and collapsed buildings while the distant sound of sirens created a constant wail that seemed to mourn the death of civilization itself. Sarah's phone finally connected to the emergency broadcast system, but instead of reassuring official statements, they heard only fragmented warnings about avoiding populated areas and seeking shelter, confirmation that whatever had started in their hospital was now a citywide catastrophe. Elena used her security radio to contact other emergency responders, but the responses were either panicked reports of similar outbreaks or ominous silence that suggested the worst possible outcomes. Through Dr. Webb's binoculars, they could see that the streets below were filled with both the infected and terrified survivors, creating a chaotic battlefield where the rules of society had completely broken down and only the most adaptable would survive. Tommy pointed toward the hospital's helicopter landing pad, where an abandoned news helicopter sat like a beacon of hope, but Jake's inspection revealed that the fuel tank was empty and the communication equipment had been destroyed, leaving them stranded on the rooftop with nowhere to go but down. As darkness began to fall across the burning city, Sarah realized that their escape from the hospital had only been the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous journey, one that would test everything they thought they knew about human nature, survival, and what it truly meant to be alive in a world where death no longer offered the finality it once had. The small group huddled together on the rooftop, sharing what little food and water they had while making plans for their next move, knowing that staying in one place too long would mean certain death but also understanding that venturing into the infected city below would require courage none of them were sure they possessed. Webb's military training began to show as he organized their meager supplies and established a watch schedule, while Elena's security experience proved invaluable in identifying potential escape routes and defensive positions. Sarah found herself naturally taking on a leadership role, her medical knowledge making her invaluable for treating injuries and understanding the nature of the infection, while Tommy's youth and agility made him an excellent scout and Jake's practical skills kept them equipped with improvised weapons and tools. As they watched the city burn beneath them and listened to the endless moans of the undead echoing through the night, each member of their small group understood that they were no longer just individuals trying to survive. They had become a family forged by necessity and bound together by the shared experience of witnessing the end of the world and somehow living to tell about it. Dawn brought no relief to the exhausted group huddled on the hospital rooftop, only the stark reality of a city transformed into a graveyard where the dead walked among the living and safety existed only in fleeting moments between one crisis and the next. Dr. Webb had spent the night studying the infection's progression through his binoculars, watching as the creatures below seemed to move with increasing coordination, no longer just mindless wanderers but something more disturbing, hunters who were learning to work together in pursuit of their prey. Sarah had used her medical training to observe the infected from their high vantage point, noting that the fresher casualties moved faster and seemed more aware of their surroundings than those who had been turned for longer periods, suggesting that the infection might be evolving or that the human consciousness took time to fully disappear. When Webb mentioned his suburban home 20 miles outside the city, describing the reinforced basement he'd been secretly preparing for years as part of his military-trained paranoia, the group seized on this information like drowning people grasping for a life preserver. Elena's security experience proved invaluable as she mapped out a route through the city's service tunnels and maintenance areas, avoiding the main streets where the infected congregated in ever-growing numbers, while Jake's knowledge of the hospital's vehicle fleet led them to a reinforced ambulance that had been abandoned in the underground garage. The journey through the infected city was a nightmare of stop-and-go progress, with Tommy serving as their lookout while Elena drove the ambulance through streets littered with abandoned cars and the walking dead. Sarah found herself constantly treating minor injuries as broken glass and debris took their toll, but more concerning was the way the infected seemed to respond to the ambulance's engine noise, following the vehicle in growing numbers as if they were developing the ability to associate sounds with potential prey. They were forced to make several detours when major intersections proved impassable, clogged with the remnants of failed military checkpoints and overturned evacuation buses that had become feeding grounds for the undead. Jake's mechanical skills kept the ambulance running when the engine began to overheat, while Dr. Webb's tactical knowledge helped them navigate through residential areas where the infected were less concentrated but individual houses had become death traps for families who had barricaded themselves inside without adequate supplies or escape routes. The most harrowing moment came when they stopped to siphon gasoline from an abandoned service station, only to discover that the building's interior was filled with infected who had once been customers and employees, their business attire and uniforms now torn and bloodied as they pressed against the reinforced glass doors like fish in a deadly aquarium. Webb's house sat on a wooded hillside that had once represented suburban tranquility but now felt like an isolated fortress surrounded by an ocean of chaos and death. The property was surrounded by a high fence that Webb had installed under the pretense of privacy, but Sarah quickly realized that every modification to the house had been made with security in mind, from the reinforced doors and windows to the basement that had been converted into a fully stocked survival bunker. The group spent their first week establishing routines and securing their perimeter, with Elena taking charge of defense planning while Sarah organized their medical supplies and Jake worked to improve their water filtration and power systems. Tommy proved surprisingly resourceful at foraging for additional supplies in the surrounding abandoned homes, though each expedition revealed more evidence of the infection's spread and the breakdown of organized resistance. Their temporary safety allowed them to process what they had experienced and witnessed, but it also gave them time to understand the true scope of the catastrophe through emergency radio broadcasts that painted a picture of global collapse and governmental failure. Sarah found herself becoming the group's unofficial leader, her medical training and calm demeanor helping to resolve conflicts and maintain morale while Webb's military background provided tactical expertise and Elena's security experience kept them vigilant against threats both external and internal. The illusion of safety shattered on their 8th night when Sarah was awakened by sounds that didn't belong in their carefully secured environment, the shuffling of feet and low moaning that had become the soundtrack of their new reality. Through the reinforced window, she watched in horror as their infected neighbors, the Morrison family from 3 houses down, approached their fence with a coordination that defied everything they thought they knew about the creature's capabilities. These weren't the shambling, mindless zombies they had encountered in the city, but something more evolved and dangerous, moving with purpose and what appeared to be basic problem-solving abilities as they systematically tested the fence's weak points. Webb's preparation had accounted for many scenarios, but not for infected who could learn and adapt, and certainly not for the moment when the creatures began to coordinate their attack, with some drawing the group's attention at the front of the house while others approached from the basement tunnel that Webb had never considered might work both ways. The attack came with devastating swiftness, forcing them to abandon most of their supplies and flee through the very tunnel system that had been meant to provide ultimate security, emerging into a world that had grown even more dangerous during their brief period of false safety. As they ran through the dark woods with only the supplies they could carry, Sarah realized that their week of relative peace had been nothing more than a cruel intermission before the next act of their survival story, one that would test not just their physical endurance but their ability to maintain hope and humanity in a world where both seemed to be disappearing with each passing day. The emergency radio transmission crackled through the static-filled airwaves like a voice from another world, promising salvation in the form of a military safe zone established in the Rocky Mountains, 200 miles away through territory that had become a wasteland of abandoned towns and roving hordes of the infected. Sarah clutched the radio with trembling hands as the automated message repeated its coordinates and instructions, knowing that this fragile signal represented their only hope of finding other survivors and perhaps even a cure for the nightmare that had consumed their world. Dr. Webb studied their stolen road atlas with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign, tracing potential routes through small towns and back roads that might offer safer passage than the major highways, which intelligence reports suggested had become killing fields where abandoned vehicles created perfect ambush points for both the infected and desperate human survivors. The ambulance they had commandeered from the hospital sat like a beacon of hope in the pre-dawn darkness, its medical supplies and reinforced construction making it an ideal vehicle for their dangerous journey, though Elena's security training reminded them that the same features that made it valuable also made it a target for other survivors who might be willing to kill for resources. Tommy had spent the night fashioning improvised weapons from materials scavenged from Webb's destroyed safe house, his teenage ingenuity creating spears from kitchen knives and broomsticks while Jake reinforced the ambulance's windows with metal sheeting that would provide protection without completely blocking their view of the road ahead. The first day of their journey took them through rural farmland where the infection had spread more slowly but with equally devastating results, transforming entire families into wandering groups of predators who moved through the fields like a grotesque parody of their former agricultural routine. They encountered their first group of living survivors at a roadside diner that had been converted into a makeshift fortress, where a family of 5 had barricaded themselves inside with enough supplies to last several weeks but not enough weapons to defend against the growing numbers of infected that gathered outside their walls each night. The family's patriarch, a grizzled farmer named Bill Henderson, shared information about safe routes in dangerous areas in exchange for medical attention from Sarah, who treated his wife's infected bite wound while privately knowing that the woman had perhaps hours before the fever would claim her. The emotional weight of leaving the Henderson family behind, knowing they faced certain death but lacking the resources to save them, created a tension within the group that would only grow as they encountered more survivors in similarly hopeless situations. Elena's pragmatic approach to survival often clashed with Sarah's medical oath to help others, while Webb's military training taught him to think in terms of acceptable losses and Tommy's youth made him question whether they were becoming monsters themselves by choosing who lived and who died. Their most terrifying encounter came at what appeared to be an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of a small town, where the group stopped to siphon fuel and search for supplies, only to discover that the building was surrounded by the largest concentration of infected they had ever seen. The creatures seemed to be drawn to the location by something beyond their usual hunt for prey, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested a level of intelligence that defied everything the group thought they knew about the infection's effects on human consciousness. Sarah realized with growing horror that the infected were using the gas station as a kind of meeting point, gathering there before dispersing in organized groups to hunt in the surrounding area, demonstrating an evolution in their behavior that made traditional survival tactics obsolete. The group found themselves trapped inside the station's reinforced office as hundreds of infected surrounded the building, their moans creating a sound like rushing water that seemed to call even more of the creatures from the surrounding countryside. Jake's mechanical skills proved crucial as he managed to create a distraction by rigging several car alarms to activate simultaneously, drawing most of the horde away from the building while the group escaped through a back window, but not before Tommy suffered a severe leg injury when he fell through a broken section of roofing while trying to reach their ambulance. The remainder of their journey became a race against time as Tommy's condition deteriorated and their medical supplies dwindled, forcing Sarah to perform emergency surgery in the back of the moving ambulance while Elena drove through increasingly dangerous territory and Webb provided security from the passenger seat. The radio transmissions from the mountain safe zone grew stronger as they approached the coordinates, but so did the signs of military activity, from abandoned checkpoints to the scattered remains of equipment that suggested the situation was far more complex than the broadcasts indicated. Sarah's hands shook as she worked to stabilize Tommy's injured leg, knowing that infection was a constant threat even from non-zombie-related wounds, while the young man's fever and delirium reminded her of the symptoms she had seen in patients during the early stages of the outbreak. The group's unity was tested as never before when they were forced to choose between stopping to give Tommy proper medical attention and continuing toward the safe zone before their fuel ran out, a decision that would haunt them regardless of what they chose. As they crested the final hill before reaching the military coordinates, Sarah looked back at the infected landscape they had traveled through and realized that even if the safe zone proved to be everything they hoped for, the journey itself had changed them in ways that could never be undone, transforming them from ordinary people into hardened survivors who had learned to make impossible choices in a world where mercy and pragmatism often stood in deadly opposition to each other. The military checkpoint appeared through the mountain mist like a mirage of salvation, complete with razor wire, watchtowers, and armed guards who waved them through with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested order had been restored to at least this small corner of the world. Sarah felt her heart lift for the first time in weeks as they drove through the fortified gates, past rows of military vehicles and temporary buildings that housed what appeared to be hundreds of survivors who had successfully made the same desperate journey they had just completed. Colonel Mitchell Hayes greeted them personally at the medical tent where Tommy was immediately taken for treatment, his weathered face and commanding presence radiating the kind of authority that had been absent from their lives since the outbreak began, though something in his pale blue eyes made Sarah's medical instincts whisper warnings she couldn't quite articulate. The compound was impressive in its organization and scope, with designated areas for housing, food distribution, medical care, and even recreational activities, creating the illusion that humanity had successfully regrouped and was fighting back against the infection that had claimed so much of the world. Dr. Webb was immediately impressed by the military's tactical setup and weapons cache, while Elena found herself comparing notes with the security personnel who had established defensive protocols that seemed both comprehensive and battle-tested. Jake marveled at the mechanical workshops where vehicles were being modified for zombie combat, and even Tommy, despite his injury, was inspired by the sight of children playing in a protected courtyard where the sounds of laughter had returned to a world that had forgotten such simple pleasures. The first signs that something was wrong came during their mandatory orientation session, when Hayes explained that all survivors were required to undergo comprehensive medical evaluation and behavioral assessment before being granted full access to the compound's resources and protection. Sarah's medical training immediately recognized the terminology and procedures being described as far beyond what would be necessary for simple health screening, resembling instead the kind of experimental protocols she had encountered in research hospitals where ethics committees maintained strict oversight of human subjects. The sleeping quarters they were assigned felt more like prison cells than refugee housing, with locks on the outside and windows that had been reinforced not to keep the infected out but to keep the occupants in, a discovery that Elena made during her first night when she tested the security measures out of professional curiosity. Their growing suspicions were confirmed when they witnessed other survivors being forcibly separated from their families and taken to restricted areas of the compound, returning days later as hollow-eyed shells of their former selves who spoke in whispers about contributing to the greater good and necessary sacrifices for scientific progress. Webb's military connections allowed him to gather intelligence from sympathetic guards who revealed that Hayes had gone rogue months earlier, establishing the compound not as a safe zone but as a research facility where survivors were being used as test subjects in experiments designed to weaponize the infection rather than cure it. The colonel's true plan became horrifyingly clear when Sarah discovered that he had been deliberately exposing survivors to infected subjects under controlled conditions, studying their responses and using the data to develop biological weapons that could be used to control populations even after the current crisis had passed. The group's refusal to cooperate with Hayes' research program resulted in their immediate reclassification from survivors to test subjects, leading to their confinement in what the colonel euphemistically called observation cells, but which were clearly designed to contain people who were about to become unwilling participants in deadly experiments. Sarah found herself sharing a cell with Dr. Martinez, an epidemiologist who had been at the compound for 3 months and had secretly been documenting Hayes' illegal activities while pretending to cooperate with his research, her hidden notes revealing the true scope of the colonel's crimes against humanity. The revelation that some people possessed natural immunity to the infection became a crucial discovery when Sarah realized that she had been exposed to infected blood multiple times during their journey without showing any symptoms, a genetic advantage that made her invaluable to Hayes' research but also potentially the key to their escape. Martinez explained that the immunity seemed to be linked to specific genetic markers that appeared in roughly 1% of the population, information that Hayes was using to identify immune individuals for his most dangerous experiments while eliminating those who couldn't contribute to his research. The underground resistance movement within the compound had been growing steadily as more survivors discovered the truth about Hayes' operation, led by a former CDC researcher named Dr. Sarah Kim who had been secretly working to sabotage the colonel's experiments while gathering evidence of his war crimes. The rebellion began when Sarah's immunity test results were deliberately falsified by sympathetic medical staff, buying the group time to plan their escape while Hayes believed he had secured his most valuable research subject. Elena's security training proved invaluable in identifying weaknesses in the compound's internal defenses, while Webb's military knowledge helped them understand the guard rotations and communication protocols that would need to be disrupted during their escape attempt. Jake's mechanical skills became crucial when he discovered that the compound's power grid had been deliberately designed with multiple redundancies to prevent sabotage, requiring a coordinated attack on several key systems simultaneously to create the chaos necessary for their breakout. The escape itself was a nightmare of split-second timing and desperate courage, with Tommy's injury forcing them to rely on improvised mobility aids while fighting through corridors filled with panicked guards and accidentally released infected subjects that Hayes had been keeping for his experiments. The cost of their freedom was measured in the lives of fellow survivors who stayed behind to ensure the group's escape, including Dr. Martinez who sacrificed herself to destroy Hayes' research data and prevent him from continuing his experiments with other victims. As they fled the compound in a stolen military vehicle, Sarah realized that their encounter with Hayes had taught them a harsh lesson about the different kinds of monsters that emerged during times of crisis, and that sometimes the greatest threats to humanity came not from the infected but from the survivors who had lost their moral compass while fighting to save themselves. The burning compound in their rearview mirror represented not just another failed safe zone but a reminder that in this new world, trust had become a luxury they could no longer afford, and that their journey toward true sanctuary would require them to remain vigilant against enemies both living and dead. The abandoned subway entrance appeared through the snow-covered ruins like a mouth leading to the underworld, its darkened tunnels offering the only refuge available to the group as they fled Colonel Hayes' burning compound with military vehicles in pursuit and the winter cold threatening to claim them as surely as any infected horde. Sarah's breath formed crystalline clouds in the frigid air as she helped Tommy navigate the treacherous descent into what had once been part of the city's public transportation system, now transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and echoing footsteps that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth's depths. The stolen military radio crackled with Hayes' furious commands to his remaining forces, painting a picture of a man whose carefully constructed empire of horror was crumbling around him, though Sarah knew that his resources and ruthless determination made him a threat that would follow them until one of them was dead. Elena's security training proved invaluable as she led the group through the tunnel system using emergency lighting and her phone's GPS to navigate toward what Jake insisted was an abandoned maintenance depot where they might find tools and supplies, though the darkness around them seemed filled with unseen dangers that made every footstep sound like thunder in the oppressive silence. The first signs of habitation came in the form of carefully constructed barricades and the faint glow of electric lighting that suggested someone had restored power to sections of the underground network, discoveries that filled the group with both hope and apprehension as they realized they were entering territory controlled by unknown survivors who might be friend or foe. The voice that challenged them from the shadows belonged to Maria Santos, a former CDC researcher whose command of the underground community was immediately apparent in the way armed guards materialized from hidden positions to escort the newcomers through a security checkpoint that rivaled anything they had encountered at Hayes' compound. Sarah found herself impressed by the sophistication of the settlement that had been carved out of the subway system, with living quarters, workshops, medical facilities, and even hydroponic gardens that provided fresh food for the hundreds of survivors who had made this subterranean world their home. Maria's background in epidemiology and infectious disease research had made her a natural leader for the community, which she had organized around the dual goals of survival and scientific research, pursuing a cure for the infection while maintaining the kind of civilized society that had been lost in the surface world. The medical facilities were particularly impressive, equipped with salvaged hospital equipment and staffed by doctors and nurses who had escaped the initial outbreak, creating a research environment that was both more ethical and more effective than anything Hayes had constructed with his military resources. Webb's military experience was welcomed by the community's defense coordinators, while Elena's security background made her valuable for patrol duties and Tommy's youth and adaptability helped him quickly integrate with the other survivors who had found refuge in the underground sanctuary. The revelation of Sarah's immunity to the infection created a sensation within the research community, with Maria explaining that they had been searching for naturally immune individuals for months without success, knowing that such people represented the key to developing both a cure and a vaccine that could restore the surface world to human control. The underground laboratory was a marvel of improvised scientific equipment and salvaged materials, where researchers had been working around the clock to understand the infection's mechanism and develop countermeasures, though their progress had been limited by the lack of immune test subjects and the constant threat of discovery by hostile forces. Sarah's willingness to participate in the research as a volunteer rather than a test subject created an atmosphere of collaboration and hope that had been absent from Hayes' coercive experiments, though she found herself struggling with the traumatic memories of her experiences at the compound and the weight of knowing that her blood might hold the key to humanity's survival. The process of blood analysis and genetic testing revealed that Sarah's immunity was linked to a rare genetic mutation that appeared in less than 1% of the population. Information that both excited the researchers and terrified Sarah as she realized the implications for her future and her relationship with the other survivors. Maria's ethical approach to research meant that Sarah was fully informed about every procedure and given the right to refuse any treatment she found uncomfortable, a level of respect and autonomy that helped her begin to heal from the psychological trauma of Hayes' betrayal while contributing to work that might save the world. The discovery that winter was making surface survival increasingly difficult for both the living and the infected created a sense of urgency within the underground community, as researchers worked to develop their cure before spring brought new waves of infection and the inevitable return of hostile human forces seeking to exploit or destroy their sanctuary. Sarah's daily routine became a balance between research participation, medical training with the community's healthcare providers, and personal recovery from the trauma she had experienced, though she found herself haunted by nightmares of Hayes' experiments and the knowledge that other survivors were still suffering in similar facilities. The underground society had developed its own culture and governance system, with elected councils making decisions about resource allocation and defense while maintaining the democratic principles that had been abandoned in much of the surface world, creating a model for how civilization might be rebuilt once the infection was defeated. Tommy's recovery from his leg injury progressed steadily under the care of the community's medical staff, while Jake's mechanical skills made him invaluable in maintaining the complex systems that kept their underground world functioning, from water purification to electrical generation to the ventilation systems that prevented the accumulation of dangerous gases. Elena found herself taking on increased responsibility for the community's security as reports filtered in about Hayes' continued search for their location, knowing that their sanctuary's existence depended on maintaining secrecy while preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Colonel's forces. As Sarah watched the researchers work with samples of her blood and listened to their excited discussions about breakthrough discoveries, she began to understand that her role in the fight against the infection was far from over, and that the choice between personal safety and humanity's survival would soon demand everything she had to give. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday that would forever mark the turning point between humanity's darkest hour and its potential redemption, When Maria Santos burst into the sleeping quarters with tears streaming down her face and news that the research team had successfully synthesized a working vaccine using Sarah's genetic material and months of painstaking laboratory work. The vaccine required a complex extraction process that would use nearly all of Sarah's blood plasma over a period of several hours, a procedure that carried significant risks including potential organ failure, cardiac arrest, and death, though the alternative was allowing humanity to continue its slide toward extinction while the infected grew more organized and dangerous with each passing day. Sarah stared at the research data spread across Maria's desk, understanding enough of the medical terminology to comprehend both the miraculous nature of their discovery and the terrible price that achieving mass production would demand from her body, a sacrifice that would either save the world or kill her in the attempt. Dr. Webb's military training had taught him to think in terms of acceptable casualties and strategic objectives, leading him to argue that Sarah's sacrifice was not only justified but necessary, while Elena's security background made her focus on the practical implications of producing enough vaccine to make a meaningful difference in the war against the infection. Tommy's youth and emotional connection to Sarah made him the most vocal opponent of the procedure, his arguments about finding alternative solutions revealing the same optimism and determination that had helped him survive his injury and adapt to their underground life. The moral complexity of the situation deepened when Maria revealed that the extraction process could potentially be repeated with other immune individuals if they could be found and brought to the underground facility, though statistical analysis suggested that locating even a handful of such people would require searching through hundreds of thousands of survivors scattered across the infected landscape. Sarah found herself torn between her medical oath to do no harm and her understanding that refusing the procedure would condemn countless innocent people to death or transformation, a decision that was further complicated by her growing relationship with the underground community and her desire to see Tommy, Elena, Jake, and Webb survive in a world that offered some hope for the future. The debate within the community became heated as word of the potential cure spread through the tunnels, with some survivors arguing that Sarah had no right to refuse a procedure that could save humanity while others maintained that forcing her to sacrifice her life would make them no better than Colonel Hayes in his brutal experiments. Maria's leadership was tested as never before as she tried to balance the scientific imperative to pursue the cure with the ethical principles that had made their community a beacon of hope in a world gone mad, knowing that the wrong decision could destroy both their research and their moral foundation. Elena's security reports brought additional urgency to the situation when her scouts discovered evidence that Hayes had located their general area and was systematically searching the tunnel system with infected subjects that he was using as bloodhounds, their enhanced senses allowing them to track human scent through the underground passages that had once provided perfect concealment. The decision was taken out of Sarah's hands when Hayes' assault began with a coordinated attack on multiple entrance points, his remaining forces using military explosives to breach the community's outer defenses while releasing infected subjects into the tunnel system to create chaos and panic among the defenders. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that her choice was no longer between life and death but between dying meaninglessly in the coming battle or sacrificing herself to ensure that her death would have meaning beyond the immediate moment, a decision that was made easier by her observation of the courage and dedication shown by the community members who were preparing to defend their sanctuary with their lives. Maria's research team worked frantically to set up the extraction equipment in the deepest part of the facility while Elena coordinated the defense of their position, her security training proving invaluable as she organized civilians into effective fighting units and established fallback positions that would buy them the time needed to complete the procedure. The sounds of battle echoed through the tunnels as Webb led a team of volunteers to delay Hayes' advance, their improvised weapons and desperate courage pitted against military training and equipment in a confrontation that would determine whether the cure would be completed or destroyed along with everyone who had worked to create it. Tommy's refusal to leave Sarah's side during the extraction procedure provided emotional support that helped her endure the physical ordeal of having her life slowly drained away for the greater good, while Jake's mechanical skills kept the laboratory equipment functioning despite power fluctuations caused by the ongoing battle. The final confrontation between Hayes and the underground community played out in the laboratory itself, where the Colonel's discovery of the cure research transformed his military objectives from capture and control to complete destruction of what he saw as a threat to his vision of a world where only the strong deserved to survive. Sarah's weakened condition from the extraction procedure left her unable to defend herself when Hayes broke through the last line of defense, Though Elena's sacrifice in engaging the Colonel in hand-to-hand combat bought Maria the crucial seconds needed to complete the vaccine synthesis and secure the samples that would allow mass production. The explosion that brought down part of the tunnel system was Hayes' final act of vindictive destruction, though his death and the collapse ensured that his threat to the community and the cure research died with him, leaving the survivors to dig themselves out of the rubble and assess the cost of their victory. Sarah's survival of the extraction procedure defied the statistical predictions that had suggested she would not live through the process, though her recovery would require months of careful medical treatment and rehabilitation that the community's resources could barely support. The successful synthesis of the vaccine represented both the culmination of their scientific work and the beginning of an even greater challenge, as they now faced the task of distributing the cure to survivor communities across the infected landscape while rebuilding their own society from the devastation of Hayes' final assault. As Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness during her recovery, she could hear the sounds of reconstruction and planning that marked the beginning of humanity's fight back against the infection, knowing that her sacrifice had given the world something it had nearly lost forever, the possibility of hope and the chance to reclaim what had been taken from them by the walking dead. 6 months after the cure's synthesis, Sarah stood on the hillside overlooking New Haven, the settlement that had grown from the ashes of their underground refuge into a thriving community of over 3,000 survivors who had come from across the infected territories seeking the hope that the vaccine represented. The scars on her arms from the extraction procedure had faded to thin white lines that served as permanent reminders of the day she had chosen to risk everything for humanity's future, though the deeper scars from their journey through the apocalypse would take much longer to heal completely. The distribution network that Maria Santos had organized was a marvel of coordination and courage, with teams of immune volunteers traveling through dangerous territory to deliver vaccine doses to isolated survivor communities, creating a web of safe zones that were slowly expanding outward from their mountain stronghold. Dr. Webb had established a training academy where new medical personnel learned not only how to administer the vaccine but how to identify and treat the psychological trauma that had become as much a part of the infection's legacy as the physical symptoms, understanding that healing the mind was as crucial as healing the body in this new world. Elena Rodriguez had become the head of New Haven's security forces, her experience with both human and infected threats making her invaluable in developing defensive strategies that protected the community while allowing for controlled expansion into the surrounding wilderness where small groups of infected still posed occasional dangers. The children's laughter that echoed across the settlement's central courtyard represented something that had been absent from the world for too long, a sound that reminded everyone why they had fought so hard to preserve humanity's future despite the overwhelming odds against their survival. Tommy Chen, now 19 and fully recovered from his leg injury, had become one of New Haven's most effective scouts and ambassadors, his youth and optimism helping to convince other survivor groups to trust the vaccine program and join the growing network of interconnected communities. Jake Morrison's mechanical workshop had evolved into a manufacturing center where teams of engineers and craftspeople worked to rebuild the infrastructure necessary for a functioning society, from communication systems that linked distant settlements to water purification plants that ensured clean drinking water for the growing population. The memorial wall that stood at the center of New Haven bore the names of all those who had died during the journey from the hospital to this moment of hope, including Dr. Martinez, Elena's security partner from the hospital, and the countless unnamed victims whose sacrifice had made their survival possible. Sarah's role had evolved from reluctant survivor to community leader, her medical expertise and moral authority making her a natural choice for the settlement's governing council, though she often found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility of helping to shape humanity's future while still processing the trauma of everything they had endured. The radio transmissions that arrived daily from other settlements painted a picture of a world slowly healing from the infection's devastation, with reports of successful vaccine distributions, expanding safe zones, and the gradual restoration of basic services like electricity and communication networks that had been lost during the initial outbreak. The infected population was declining steadily as the vaccine prevented new transmissions and the existing zombies were systematically eliminated by coordinated military operations led by former soldiers like Webb who had survived the apocalypse and learned from their experiences. Sarah's medical research had continued even after her recovery, with her unique immunity providing insights into genetic resistance factors that might protect future generations from similar pandemics, work that she pursued with the same dedication that had driven her to risk her life for the original cure. The psychological healing process was ongoing for all the survivors, with counseling programs and support groups helping people process their experiences and find ways to build meaningful lives in a world that bore little resemblance to the one they had known before the outbreak. Maria Santos had established research centers in several settlements where teams of scientists worked to prevent future outbreaks while developing treatments for the long-term effects of exposure to the infection, creating a medical network that was more robust and ethically grounded than anything that had existed in the previous world. The sunset over New Haven painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to symbolize both the blood that had been shed and the hope that had emerged from humanity's darkest hour, a daily reminder that beauty and peace were still possible even after experiencing the worst that the world could offer. Sarah often walked these hills in the evening, reflecting on the journey that had taken her from a hospital nurse to a reluctant hero to a leader in humanity's recovery, understanding that while the world had indeed ended, something new and potentially better had risen from its ruins. The relationships forged in the crucible of survival had created bonds stronger than family, with Webb serving as a father figure to Tommy, Elena acting as a protective sister to Sarah, and Jake providing the steady, reliable presence that kept them all grounded in practical reality while they worked to build their impossible dreams. The lessons learned during their struggle against both the infected and hostile humans had shaped the principles that govern New Haven and its allied settlements, creating communities based on cooperation, ethical leadership, and the understanding that survival meant nothing without preserving the humanity that made life worth living. The vaccine production facilities now operated at full capacity, sending doses to remote areas where isolated survivor groups still faced the constant threat of infection, while research teams worked to develop more efficient distribution methods that could reach every remaining human settlement on the continent. As Sarah stood watching the children play in the courtyard below, their carefree laughter mixing with the sounds of construction and conversation that marked a living community, she realized that the story of the day the world ended was also the story of the day the world began again, and that sometimes the most important victories were measured not in battles won but in the simple act of choosing hope over despair when everything seemed lost. The future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten book, full of challenges and possibilities that would test everything they had learned about survival, leadership, and the resilience of the human spirit. But for the first time since that terrible morning in the hospital emergency room, Sarah felt confident that they were ready to face whatever came next together.